Good evening. Welcome to our shir, a shir that we're going to have on Purim. We're going to start off by thanking our sponsors. So a special thank you to David and Ruth Zimmerman. They are sponsoring this shir to commemorate the yard site of David's mother, Etka Sarah Bat Yitzchak, Zechrona Livracha. The yard site is on this Shabbos, so we thank you very much for the sponsorship, and may the neshama benefit from our gathering here tonight and the study of the words of Torah. We also have a little bit of a goal to get into the Purim spirit. Get into the Purim spirit, and it's a time to be uplifted. It's a time to appreciate the fact that we are here, that we, the Jewish nation, have something to teach to the world, that we are making a contribution to the world, and all the wonderful messages that this very special holiday carries are ones that we achieve if we are mindful of them. And therefore, when we review a little bit about Purim, it's important to remember that we should view it as a preparation that come the day itself. Yes, there are very special mitzvot that we want to perform. We want to hear the Megillah. We want to go ahead and be sure that we give matanas levyonim and a mishloach manos and a sudas Purim. All these things are important. But Judaism expects us as well to be mindful of what the day is about, read up, be appreciative, right? And that's what brings us happiness. Now, to start our discussion, we do know that our tradition tells us that part of the preparation for Purim is to remember an incident that occurred in the wilderness. That as we are departing Egypt, we are attacked by a nation, by the nation of Amalek. This is a brutal attack. It's not provoked. It comes with terrible hatred, not just to the Jewish people, but to the message of the Jewish people, because by us, the people of Israel, being present in this world, we are saying and we are stating something. And there are times that there are people that simply don't want to hear the message of what Judaism is about, so they kill the messenger, or so they attempt. And the rabbis in our tradition wants us to walk into Purim and beforehand be sure that we fulfill a mitzvah of uprooting the memory of Amalek, which needs a tremendous amount of clarification. What does it mean to uproot a memory? If you uproot a memory, it's no longer there, so you won't need to remember it next year. And we have to ask ourselves, we're not going to war, right? We have no ability to identify with certainty who is Amalek. And even if we would know that we have identified a nation and they are direct descendants of that nation that attacked us as we departed from Egypt, there's no expectation that we go and attack them, right? So even if we log in and we figure out who are the Amalek today by logging into some website that has genetic information, and they could go ahead and identify individuals as purebred descendants of Amalek, we won't do it. So what is the mitzvah about? And we're going to do it. This Shabbos, we're going to have a Torah reading, and if you're at home, you're going to read that section that relates to Amalek. And you're going to have to remember that there's something we need to uproot. There's something that we have to go ahead and purge. What are we trying to achieve? And that needs some clarity. So before we even start addressing it, I want to return to a story that appears in the Torah, in Bereshit, in Parashat Vayetze. Keep that question in mind, and then we'll return to our discussion today. So the story I would like to discuss relates to Yosef's birth. In other words, Yaakov, we know the story of Yaakov. He works for two wives, 7 years for each one. As the 14-year passes, he turns to his father-in-law and says, it's time for me to leave. Okay? And there's a fascinating rabbinic reading that appears in all the midrashim. The midrash tells us, we are told in the Torah, Ka'asher Yalda Rachel et Yosef, with the birth of Yosef, Yaakov felt now is a good time for me to return and confront my brother Esav. You have to remember that this is a brother that carries hatred. And it was something that Yaakov is mindful of. With the birth of Yosef, Yaakov feels confident, I can make it back, I could confront my brother. And the rabbis tell us, Mishonolad sitno shel Esav. In other words, the reason the birth of Yosef gave Yaakov this ability, or he had this prophetic sense that now that I have this child, I could confront in Esav and deal with the challenge of Esav, is because Yosef himself had within him somehow the ability to address the problem of Esav. Okay? And again, the words of the rabbi, Yosef is the sitno shel Esav, the one that could confront Esav. Now, Esav's hatred becomes distilled in one of his grandchildren. The name of that grandchild is Amalek. And when you are looking for pure hatred of the people of Israel and pure hatred of the Jewish message, it's Amalek. And it appears, for whatever reason, that the one that could confront, that could address this problem called Amalek is Yosef. So therefore, my question, which we're going to hopefully get to by the end of the class, what does Yosef have to offer when it comes to that issue known as the problem of Amalek? Okay, so really we're going to start off with two things we need to address. What on earth does it mean, right, in the year 2022 to try to uproot Amalek? What does it mean? What are we trying to achieve? Number two, in what way does Yosef give us the tools? There's something we need to read about when we go through the incredible life of Yosef. There's something we have to say to ourselves, you know what? That gives us the tools to deal and address with the problem of Amalek. Okay, now, first of all, two great rabbinic thinkers of the 19th century tell us that you need to understand that as you go into this weekend and you're going to read that section of the Torah, Timche et Zachor Amalek, they tell us don't focus on people, focus on concepts, focus on a philosophy. In other words, what we need to uproot, what we need to be mindful of as we go through this experience, which is part of the preparation to Purim, we have to remember that there's a philosophy that Amalek has, and that is one that we, the people of Israel, cannot live with. We need to uproot that philosophy. Okay? So I'll quote to you the words of Rav Hirsch. It's not the Amalek, the nation that we focus on today, right? We're not going to walk out of shul on Shabbos. We're not going to go ahead and get up after reading to ourselves that section of the Torah and decide to start training in weaponry, but rather there has to be an uprooting of tehilato, teudato shel Amalek, that which they believed in. There's a philosophy that we need to uproot. So that's going to be the question. What exactly is that philosophy of Amalek? Right? What's the philosophy of Amalek? So we'll present two different approaches. Approach number one is one we've addressed over the years. We, the people of Israel, Klal Yisrael, went through a Holocaust. And yes, there are still survivors today. The brutality of the Holocaust is something that we've studied, we've learned, we've heard. And without a doubt, part of the mitzvah of remembering and being sure that future generations know about it relates to Shoah as well. Now, there's no nice way to say it, but there was a nation behind the Shoah, perhaps even a continent, but there was a nation. And they are the Germans. Now, again, we do know a little bit of the politics that Hitler did not come to power with a majority. We know, we're educated. But reality is that within the nation of Germania, of Germany, a philosophy evolved, a philosophy developed, an attitude developed that killed 6 million with a brutality that whenever you interact with someone that experienced it, you know very well that it was something beyond rational, right? I remember hearing the story that a woman here in Toronto, decided to take a survivor. I'm not going to mention the name. A survivor decided to take her children to see Schindler's List in the early 90s. And as she walked out, she turns to children and she said, "That's nothing compared to what really happened there." Come on, what ridiculous, ridiculous. Now, if Amalek is a philosophy, and we suffered from an Amalek / Germany some 75 years ago, 80 years ago. And by the way, it is not something that we decided to label that Amalek is German behavior of the 1940s. It's not something we decided to do after 1945, but it is something that appears in the Talmud, that Amalek is Germania, and it's something that the Vilna Gaon teaches, that there's some kind of root of Amalek in Germany. The Vilna Gaon mentions it. It's printed many, many decades prior to the Shoah. And although we deeply believe that if a nation behaves in a righteous way, we're not going to go ahead and forever hate them. And there's a fascinating statement that the rabbis tell us, that you should know that there were descendants of Haman who taught Torah in the land of Israel, specifically in Bnei Brak. And the Talmud wants us to know that we, the Jewish people, are never going to label a race as one that is hopeless, because Judaism believes that every single human being has the ability to make a choice. And there are descendants of some terrible, terrible people in Germany, descendants today, who are sickened by what their grandparents did, right? Eichmann has a son that is very disturbed by what his father did, right? So we, the Jewish people, are going to be accepting, because we're not going to label a group, right, and blame children for actions of their fathers. That's not the Jewish way of doing things. But at the same time, there was some kind of prophetic vision that the Talmudic authorities had and the Vilna Gaon had. And it's printed in the Talmud, in the tractate Megillah, page 6, that there's something about Germany. It had a root of Amalek within it. And some believe that the attitude that existed, that we are a better race, in other words, that there are lower races and better races, and ones that land up in a colder environment become more developed, right? And they are the ones that are on the top of the pyramid, and lower races are ones that simply did not develop like we did. That is a little bit of a Amalek philosophy. And in the past, we've linked a little bit of the Nietzsche philosophy, not that Friedrich Nietzsche was, God forbid, a Nazi, but the philosophy that we are here to take the human being and make an Ubermensch, right? A Superman. And by the way, Nietzsche's teachings, which were taken over by his sister, she became a big supporter of Nazism based on this understanding that you need to go ahead and respect and value the human who develops himself and becomes a superhuman. And those that fall back, well, they have no place in a society because they're not the Ubermensch. These are philosophies of Amalek. Now, the Torah itself indicates that when Amalek attacks us, they attack the ones that are necheshalim acharecha, the weak, right? The feeble, the ones that have no support system. A philosophy that believes that you are, right, a chosen, a better race. And again, Amalek is labeled in the Torah, Reshit Goim. They were the Reshit, they were the chosen. They were the nation that believed that they are better than everyone else. They are naturally born better. And they took it one step further. We were born better, and those that cannot match up to us have no place on planet Earth. There's no need for them. That's the Amalek philosophy. It's the Amalek philosophy that unfortunately developed with Nazism in Germany. Now, there's something very fascinating that I read, and I've quoted in the past, by an individual. His name was Richard Weikart. You could look it up. And he wrote a book, and there are many videos of him, and there are articles about the role of Darwinism in Nazi racial thought. In other words, Darwin, who talks about the survival of the fittest, and the species that we see today are the ones that were able to adapt, and they are the ones that they are here because there's selection and elimination within nature. So the philosophy that existed in the years leading to the Shoah was a philosophy that based itself on it. In other words, just as nature rejects those that cannot adapt, well, we could play a role as well, and as a society, if there are those that are lower and not the chosen race, we too could play that role and assist the planet by getting rid of them. If you have a philosophy that all of existence is random, it's just a random existence, and yes, those who are fittest survive, so we could play part, we could act the way nature acts. We can reject those that are weak. They have no place within us. That's the philosophy of Amalek. You know, the Torah uses the word when Amalek attacked us, that we were lo yareh Elokim, there was no fear of God. And some commentators note that the no fear of God relates to Amalek as well, because throughout Tanakh, when you find people attacking the weak, the ones that can't support themselves, the ones that simply have no one to protect them, the Torah uses the words En Yirat Elokim. So for example, Abraham's wife is taken by Avimelech. Abraham points out there's no fear of God here. Fear of God, what does it mean that we are supposed to be people who fear God? Fear of God is an understanding that if there are those who are weak, and technically we could just push them off, get rid of them, not concern ourselves about them, but we don't. But we in turn go ahead and do whatever we can to make their life better, because we have an understanding that there's a higher being that expects that from us. That is fear of God. But remember the Miyaldot, remember the midwives in Egypt? A very powerful authority says, just get rid of the babies, get rid of the males. the baby born, no one can protect them, but they had the fear of God. When someone understands, you know what? Yes, they are weak, and yes, I can go ahead and push them off, and I can say whatever I want, and I can do whatever I desire, but I'm not, because there's a God. That is the Yirat Elokim. And that was lacking by Amalek. There's no fear of God. There's no fear of God. There are weak people. Let's get rid of them. That's in Amalek philosophy. And Judaism is all about uprooting such a philosophy. Oh, there's someone in need. I'm going to roll up my sleeves and take care of them. You know, what's Purim all about, really? What's Purim all about? Matanot ishle re'eu. There's someone that needs that boost, that emotional boost, that someone cares about them, that they see value in them. You send them food for Purim. You send them some item. You connect between people, but even more important, you give a boost to a person who needs it. What is matanot le'evyonim? Matanot le'evyonim, gift to those who are in need. Welcome to the day where we are told the mitzvah of the day. In other words, yes, we commemorate the events and we read the Megillah and we fulfill the mitzvahs. But the main focus of the day is there are those out there who are weak. There are those who have needs. We all have needs, by the way. Some have emotional, some have financial. If you could go ahead and provide on that day to someone that's in need, that's the Purim spirit. And that's the spirit that's uprooting Amalek, because Amalek's philosophy is that if you find someone that's weak and you believe they're not going to make a contribution to society, and you believe that you could create a better world without them because you want a world of Ubermenschen, of super people, get rid of them. Judaism teaches this is the day that you go ahead and say, in what way can I reach out to such a person? How can I interact with them in a way that gives them a boost? You know, among the many discussions that I would have as a teenager in yeshiva, and then with my own teenagers, thank God, relates to Purim and drinking. Purim and drinking, which is a big problem. It's a big problem. Now, I don't know to what extent, because I don't interact so much with youth, Baruch Hashem, that have that issue. But it's a problem. And it originates from a statement of Chayav Adam lebesumi bepuria, that a person is obligated to be mevusam, which some misunderstand to mean that you're supposed to get drunk. And it's a misunderstanding. It's simply a misunderstanding. Because if anyone is familiar with what Judaism is about and what proper behavior is, they would understand that this is not a proper reading. Now, I would agree that there are those who see it that way. I do remember my great Rosh Hashiva in Telz, Rabbi Levin, would get up on Purim and he would say the following: I know that there are perhaps those among you who are concerned that Jewish law says you're supposed to be drunk. So he said the following: I guarantee, don't get drunk. And if you are concerned you're going to get punished one day for not getting drunk, I take that punishment upon myself. That's what he would say. And the power of that message for a young 18-year-old was, you know what? This is not something I should be doing. It's not. And the older I get, the more I realize it's really a corruption of what the day is about. And even the wording, Chayav Adam lebesume, the words I'm quoting from the Talmud here, it means to go ahead and be comfortable. In other words, it doesn't say anywhere that you get drunk. It means that, you go ahead and drink a little bit more than usual. It gives you a little bit of a comfort, but that's it, not more. And I think one of the most powerful statements I've read comes from an authority that lived about 700 years ago. His name was Rabbi Aaron HaKohen from Lunel, from southern France, from the Provence region. And he tells us absolutely, you don't get drunk on Purim because hashikrut, getting drunk, is isur gamur, is a prohibition, he writes. En lecha avera gdola mizu, he considers it a great avera, a great violation of Jewish law. But rather, what is the day about, and how did drinking come into Jewish practice? So he writes that on Purim, you drink a touch more than usual. So hopefully on a regular Thursday afternoon, you're not drinking at all, hopefully. And if you drink a tiny bit, and by the way, ideally it should be wine, a little bit of wine, mitzvah fulfilled. But he adds, do you want to know what the purpose and the goal of that drinking is for? Because by drinking, you're going to be misameach others. In other words, if let's say your personality is such, then if people start coming into your house, you feel a little bit uncomfortable, you're a little bit on an edge. And by being a little bit on an edge, it takes away your ability to talk to people, to uplift people, to be comfortable and friendly to people. You drink a little bit just for the purpose, sheyarbe l'sameach evyonim v'inachem otam. In other words, if you have the ability to give words of comfort to others, but you are naturally a little bit on an edge, remove it with a little bit of wine and use it as a tool to uplift, to give, to support to those that are in need. Because as mentioned, the essence of Purim is uprooting a philosophy that there's no room for the weak. And that philosophy of hatred was the philosophy of Haman. Lashmid, la'arog, la'abed et hayudim, get rid of this nation that simply doesn't fit in. They have this agitating message that they don't want to hear. What was the Jewish message? The message of that we are here to give a boost to others. We are here to concern ourselves for the weak. We are here, if you look at what's doing what the Jewish world is doing now, by raising funds and davening for the welfare of the Jews in Ukraine, you realize that that's the Jewish way of dealing with things. We see someone in need, we roll up our sleeves, we do our part to make a difference. We see the weak, we're going to go ahead and make it better for them. It could be people who are weak financially. It could be people who need that emotional boost. That's what's Purim about. And the drinking is a tool within that area as well. Now, these are very significant insights into what Purim's about. Okay? Mindful of the fact that it's not a random existence. It's not just the way things work out, that there's a nation that is on top and the ones on the bottom. And if the ones on the bottom are not that superhuman, just get rid of them. No, get rid of that philosophy and rather create an environment that you support those who are in need and put thought and energy and effort into creating a better environment for those who are weak. Now, there's one other message of Purim, and one other message of the flaw of Amalek. The flaw of Amalek. Now, I want to enter into the mindset of Amalek as they show up. They were labeled Reshit Goim. In other words, they had some kind of stature that if we would visit the ancient world 3,400 years ago and want to know about the people in the region who were perhaps stronger, better looking intellectuals, or had felt that they have a lot to offer and would be labeled a top nation, it was Amalek. They were on the top. And at the same time, who would you view on the bottom? On the bottom of that pyramid or at the bottom of that ladder? Unfortunately, it was the Jewish nation who just came out of slavery. You come out of slavery, you don't develop yourself. After a few generations, the only thing you could think about is how to survive. Intellects we didn't have, right? Creativity, naturally, we wouldn't have. It was a nest that we found a Betzalel, right? We were difficult people. We suffered for centuries in Egypt. So if you would look at the world of 3,400 years ago, it would appear Amalek was on the top, the children of Israel were on the bottom. And it would remain like that. In other words, genetically, Amalek is this well-respected nation. The Jewish people can't change their destiny. So therefore, Amalek feels you get rid of them. Now, there is a philosophy or an outlook that deals with very interesting questions that address the animal kingdom and talks really about humans as well. So let's talk a little bit about giraffes. So giraffes have the ability of eating leaves from trees that grow tall, and they've been blessed with very, very long necks. And a fascinating animal to look at. So how did they develop those very, very long necks? How did that happen? So if we start with Darwin, Darwin would tell us that millions and millions of years ago, there were many, many different animals, and some of them, and the ones that developed the longer necks in a region where leaves grew very tall were the ones that survived. In other words, there were many, many giraffes that had shorter necks. They couldn't eat, they died out. So which ones survived? The fittest. Okay, that's the Darwin philosophy, the origin of the species. But there was a different philosophy that appeared a little bit earlier by Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, known as the Lamarckian philosophy. And Lamarck believed that yes, using the language of the modern world, there are genes that we do have, but somehow behavior could impact your genes. In other words, since these animals landed up in a region where the leaves were very high and their nutrition would demand from them to stretch their neck, so animals tried very, very hard to stretch their neck. That exercise of stretching one's neck became part of their genetic makeup, and their children inherited it. In other words, it is not that there were thousands of generations of giraffes that vanished because they did not have a long neck, but rather it was due to the fact that one generation stretched itself, and that impacted your behavior, could impact your offspring. Now, that approach will basically claim, if the Lamarckian teachings are correct, if I am born with a nature that's not so great, I'm not a great intellectual, but I spend my teenage years focusing on learning and developing myself and becoming much smarter as a result, those things will become part of my genetic makeup and my kids will inherit it. That's a fascinating way of thinking. Now, Lamarckian was, in general, his teachings were rejected, but it appears over the past few years, they've had a very significant comeback. There's a professor in Montreal, his name is Moshe Zeif. And Moshe Zeif did a few experiments with rats, and you're more than welcome to read up. It's very fascinating things that you could either watch on YouTube or read up in articles. But basically, there's an understanding now over the past few years that we cannot reject the Lamarckian teachings, but rather we have the ability of impacting our genes. It's known as epigenetics. In other words, some proteins that are bound to the gene, to the DNA, could turn on and off specific genes, and offspring will inherit it. Something quite incredible. Now, for this Moshe Zeif, by doing this research, he writes that this is something that's very inspiring, because this new way of looking at biology basically makes us come to a realization that we are not slaves to our genome. In other words, a person cannot say, I'm a slave. In other words, I was born one way. I was born into a specific family. I was born into a specific culture. It's done. What can I do? I can't change it. Not at all. But you have the ability to trigger a change. You can change. Don't just accept the way things are, but rather, even a lowly nation, even a nation of slaves that did not develop itself, if they suddenly make it a primary goal of their life to become better, to study, to develop, they could become a very impressive nation. So the idea, right, that that you could go ahead and pass on to your offspring, a characteristic, it's quite inspiring. And I do believe that the Amalek philosophy, a philosophy of just get rid of the weak because we are the greatest nation. We are Amalek. We are the Reshit Goim. The Jewish people, they have nothing to offer. Look at them, a nation of slaves, right? Something supernatural they claim to do, and people are going to try to be like them. The way you fight a philosophy of Amalek, that you are just born into a specific race, and as a result, you're great, is a philosophy that declares, you know what? You could change yourself. You could become a different person. And I think of a few people that really changed themselves. One is a person who changed his name, Hoshea to Yehoshua, a descendant of Yosef. And by the way, he was the one who was chosen to fight Amalek. Yoshua fights Amalek because Yoshua symbolizes the idea that if you develop yourself, that Yoshua spent his life basically trying to spend every moment with Moshe, because he understood that if I go ahead and commit myself to learning, I become a different person. And the name change represents that idea. It is Yosef, it's within the family of Yosef, and it's the message of Yosef. You could change. It's not what you were born into. Yosef turned from slave to ruler. What does that tell us? It tells us that we have the ability to change, but the epigenetics tells us, you know what? You don't just change yourself, you change the future. And that is part of the battle that we have against an Amalek. An Amalek attitude is somehow just accepting realities as is. This is a reality, you can't change it, move on. When the Yosef approach is the idea that you cannot just change yourself, you could change the future. Now, Jewish people, right? We've made a lot of contributions to the world. And a significant part of Jewish contribution is not just accepting things as they are. When you talk about, a contribution to science, contribution to thought, to philosophy, to the humanism, it is a Jewish approach of, you know what? Yes, there's a problem the way it is, but we're going to find a solution. And if you look at the events over the past few weeks with Russia and Ukraine, and every single one of us, we're concerned on many levels. Number one, for the welfare of the Jewish community in Ukraine. Number two, for the welfare of Ukrainians. These are people that are suffering, millions of them. A country that functioned like any other country and suddenly being bombarded. And at the same time, we know very, very well that our concern is a little bit broader because we're dealing here with the language that's quite terrifying from the ruler of Russia. Terrifying language. And we hope that world leaders have the wisdom to understand that, yes, there's a concern about Ukraine, but be careful, please. Be careful, right? Because if you make Mr. Putin have nothing to lose, we have a lot to lose. And you hope that these world leaders are very smart people that don't just follow one another like a row of ducks, but actually think about what needs to be done. And when I look at world leaders, the little bit I read up, there's one that impressed me. Personally, there's one that I'm very impressed by. And the attitude of a specific country makes me happy because I think that I like their approach. And the ruler I'm talking about is not Prime Minister Trudeau, but rather I'm talking about the leader of a very small country, and he is the Prime Minister of Israel. Why am I impressed with the Prime Minister of Israel? Because as all Western leaders just follow, this row, the row of ducks, Germany, France, the United States, and obviously Canada. And they're going to go ahead and, just give Ukraine whatever they need without looking at a bigger picture. Here we have a fresh prime minister, Naftali Bennett, who decides, you know what? I'm going to be careful what I say about Putin, and I'm going to go ahead and try to do something about it. And behind the scenes, and I mean, it was a public trip last Shabbos to Moscow to meet Putin, the first world leader who rolled up his sleeves and actually decides, you know what, I'm going to try to work something out, because the goal shouldn't just be to punish. The goal should be to try to find some solution to this problem. And yeah, perhaps the international community should pressure Ukraine a little bit, that there are eastern parts that belong to Russia, they're more Russian there, and not be so stubborn, perhaps to avoid a catastrophe that we don't want to even think about. So who thinks like that? Not Mr. Biden, right? And not Mr. New German Olaf, but rather the prime minister of the Jewish state. And the whole attitude that Israel is taking is trying to balance it, because they see a role by understanding you don't just accept things as they are. You try to think a little bit out of the box. And a belief in self, that's what Naftali Bennett is about, a person that believes that I can make a difference here. Will it succeed? I don't know. Can we daven for a solution? I think we should. Should we daven that the Rabban Shalom should give some wisdom to world leaders and realize that, we don't just, make the Ukrainians into all tzaddikim, but rather realize that we have to work out a solution here for the welfare of humanity? We have what to pray for, Rabbosai. We have what to pray for. But I see it as something very Jewish, that the Jewish people realize we could make a difference, and the difference will impact future generations. And it's something that it's so much part of our tradition, that good things we do don't just impact ourselves, but impact our children. When a person develops the ability to overcome temptation, to become a better person, to work on their midos, on their attributes, the impact carries on to the future, is something that Judaism teaches, and it is something that Lamarckian teachings and epigenetics addresses. And I think that's inspiring. And if Yosef symbolizes that idea, that you could go ahead and change realities, he is the one that fights the Asa philosophy that believes that there are just good nations, weak nations, get rid of the weak. No. Judaism says that if there's an issue with a nation, improve yourself, become better, and the next generation will be even better, and the generation after that will become even better. Give an opportunity to all humans. Never reject. Don't become a racist, but become someone that realizes that everyone has the ability to grow when they have the opportunity, and the impact will be transferred to the next generation. Now, something quite fascinating in the Torah is the fact that after Yosef is born, there are some incredible activities that Yaakov gets involved in. And Yaakov begins the process of taking sheep and impacting their appearance, if you remember the story, by placing these branches that were spotted in front of the animals when they were in heat. Now, obviously, there's something supernatural there, but Yaakov doing something that impacts an animal and has an impact on the offspring is this idea, and therefore it relates very well to the coming of Yosef. It relates very well to Yosef being introduced, Amalek being what we have to fight, and the ability for us to change the future. So these are a few messages about Purim. And I think the most important one is the original one, that it's a time that we go ahead and uplift others. It's a time, that when we face, the Jewish nation face challenge, when the humanity faces challenge, we have an understanding that randomness should never be viewed as a cause, and that's what needs to be uprooted. While Haman chooses a date based on a lottery, and it's basically a declaration that everything is random, the Jewish person understands that nothing is random, right? And what it's been noted that when Haman performs the lottery to choose a month to get rid of the people of Israel, he's doing it in the month of Nisan, the first month of the year. The date that comes up is the last one of the year. That would appear random, but you realize what a gift it was, because that gave a tremendous amount of time for the Jewish people to go ahead and turn things around. In other words, if the month would have been chosen as the next month, who knows if they would have had enough time to uproot the decree. Nothing is random. The Jewish people believe in self because we believe that we have a relationship with the higher being, and it is a time to focus on that prayer. It's a time to focus on the growth of Judaism. And there's nothing we can achieve more if we come together, if we're concerned for the welfare of those that need. And that's what Purim is about. So hopefully we could take a little bit from the things we discussed here today. And it's an opportunity to wish everyone, it should be a very meaningful Purim, right? We still face some COVID challenges. I think we face some serious challenges with the war, that there's a lot to daven and concerns that I think are valid. But the Almighty who performed the Nisim during this month, may he perform Nisim, that the suffering should come to an end. And that may we merit that, just as we got a little bit of a hint of a ruler coming from Yerushalayim attempting to bring peace, may we merit a true ruler from Yerushalayim that really brings peace. And perhaps the vision, right, of someone with a kippah trying to settle a world war, perhaps it's something that the Almighty wants us to get a little bit of a taste of what's waiting for us in better days. Judaism in general is a religion of optimism. We talk about a messianic era, a time of peace, a time when humans can maximize and do incredible things because we have the ability to do so when we remove challenge and things that disturb us. May we merit. So it should be a meaningful Purim. Thank you again to our sponsors. And indeed, may the neshama of Etka Sarah Bar Yitzchak have an aliyah. And next week, we don't have